I was saying, hey, how are you doing? Good to see you. I was saying I want to get into is your work still relevant? So, looking at the current social and political climate, hey, good to see you. And how the ground is just kind of shifting beneath our feet. There's a lot of change happening. It can feel very disorienting. There can be a lot of despair associated with the change, or just a lot of doubt. And so, I've really been sitting with this question of is my work still relevant, right? And so is a question that I'm reflecting on for myself, but I also want to invite you guys to reflect on this question for yourself. So I'm thinking about my current work, why I do it, and why it remains relevant for me. And I would say my target audience is mostly professors. Of course, I'm a former professor, writers, scholars, and people like that. But I think these questions are deeper existential questions that are relevant for anybody, regardless of the kind of work that you do, right? So for those of you who don't know, I'm Dr. Catherine Sophia Bell. And I'm someone who did all the things that Black women are told we're supposed to do, right? So I got all the degrees, right? Like I have a master's, I have a PhD in philosophy. I got all the certifications. I have yoga certifications. Hey, how you doing? And those kinds of things. I got married. I was married for 17 years. I have 4 children. I have 4 children that range in age from 13 to 24. Right, so I did all the things that Black women are told we're supposed to do. I had it all and I felt trapped by it. So I liberated myself and I walked away. So I walked away from my 17-year marriage about 7 years ago, going on 8 years now. That was a great quality of life decision for me. I walked away from the academy after being a professor for 20 years. That was also a good quality of life decision for me. So I did. So I got happily unmarried and delightfully divorced in 2017. I left academia in 2023. And so the work that I do now focuses on, I basically have kind of 3 paths that I'm in right now. So one is La Belle Academy. One of the main focal points of that is La Belle Writers, and I have some course suites associated with that. I do some work around happily unmarried and around erotic empowerment. So that's kind of the second path or offer, range of offers. And then I also do some other work in the professional femdom space, right? And so, but all of that work that I currently do is very much aligned for me for who I am and where I am in this at this point in my life, right? And where I want to go moving forward, right? And so I've been thinking about, and here I'm thinking about La Belle writers in particular because I still very much identify as a professor. I still very much identify, I mean, not as a professor, as a writer and as a scholar, right? Like, so after being a professor, I am happy to no longer be in their academy because I started my own academy. But with La Belle Academy, I've been thinking through, like, is this work that I'm doing still relevant? And again, one of the reasons that I left academia is because I felt like being a professor in their academy no longer felt aligned for me, right? And I needed to do work that felt aligned for me. So even though I was well compensated for the work that I did, even though I had all the goodies, hey, how are you doing? Even though I had all the goodies, it was work that just didn't feel aligned for me anymore, right? And so I walked away on my own terms just because it wasn't aligned for me. I often say I felt like my ancestors said, get out and get out now. And I listened, I trusted my intuition and did that. But I really want to invite people to reflect on what your work is, and not only what your work is, but I would differentiate between your job and your work, or your title and your work, right? So for me, the job is like the title you may have, the employer you may work for, things like that. But your work is like that day-to-day thing that you're committed to, that thing that's connected to your purpose, your why, what you wake up in, your mission, your vision, those kinds of things, right? And so I think it's important to have a sense of what your vision is, what your mission is, what your purpose is, so that you can determine and be intentional about the value of your work. And the value of your work is not determined or over determined by the institutional spaces that you're in, right? And so there are a lot of people that I continue to work with as clients, or who are in La Belle Writers, who are still professors. And I don't think it's anything wrong with continuing to be a professor if that work still feels aligned for you. And I think it's just an important time to think about, like, as again, the ground is shifting beneath us, all kinds of programs are being eliminated. The kind of systems that were in place, which were not great to begin with, are kind of breaking apart, right? The facade of things is falling apart. The house of cards is kind of falling down. And so it's important to have a sense of, again, what your sense of purpose is, what your values are, what your morals are, what your why is, what your wants are, what are your deepest desires. What do you want to bring and contribute at this time? What kind of communities do you want to be in at this time? And have a sense of self and have a sense of value for the work that you do that's not tied to these economic structures or political structures or social structures or institutional structures, right? And so the invitation in the conversation here is to just reflect on, like, why do who are you, right? Like, that's one of the big kind of existential questions, like, who am I? What am I here for? Why do I do the things I do? What do I feel called to do? And how do I go about fulfilling that calling? And for some of us, that might be within an academic system, right? Within a college or university. For some of us, that might be outside of an academic system, right? And I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do it. My thing is never everybody should be in the academy, right? Because again, that's the system that I was in. I was an academic for 20 years. So I don't think everybody needs to be in the academy, but I also don't think everybody necessarily needs to leave the academy, right? Like, so I think it's important when you have a sense of who you are, again, your values, your sense of purpose, how you want to do the work that you do. And the work, this is not me like glorifying work or grinding out or anything like that. By work, I really do mean what you want to contribute to the world, however you want to contribute that, in whatever way you want to contribute that, right? And so again, for some people that might be within an academic structure, and that's fine. You just need to figure out like how to navigate those academic structures. For some people that might be outside of academic structures, right? And I think that is a decision that you have to kind of make with yourself. So it's important to be connected to your sense of intuition, your sense of purpose, your connection to your spirit guides, your connection to your ancestors, your connection to your value system will help determine and help you decide where or what are the best places from which you do the work that you want to do in the world, or you make the contributions that you want to make in the world, right? And for some people, it's a combination of things, right? Like, they might be still in the academy, but also do things outside of the academy in the community. Again, for me, the academy was no longer aligned with who I am and what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do it. So I walked away from it. But again, I continue to work with a lot of academics who are committed to doing that work within that institutional space. But I think it also is, again, with how things are shifting so quickly, I think it's important to think about backup plans and alternative plans, right? So I think for some people, you may exit the academy on your own terms, right? Which is something that I did. I think for some people, they will be exiting the academy on the institution's terms and not on their own terms, right? So I think it's important to think about, just how you're going to be strategic through the things that are going on right now, right? So I want to talk a little bit about La Belle Vie writers, because again, I'm thinking about for myself, the work that I'm doing and whether or not it feels relevant at this time. For me, a lot of that work is tied up right now mostly in La Belle Vie writers, right? And so for me, I started La Belle Vie writers back in 2020 during the pandemic, when there was still things were shut down, so you really couldn't go outside. We were still staying at home, quarantining, and that kind of stuff. And it was also like the summer when a lot of the social justice stuff that's being turned around now and reversed now, a lot of attention was being given to racial injustice issues and other kind of social injustice issues, right? And so I think one of the reasons why La Belle Vie Writers was really successful and helpful when it first started in 2020 was because people, myself included, just needed an anchor. Like, I knew that I still wanted to write this book that I was working on, which was the Beauvoir and Bell book. I knew that writing is important to me. Again, my identity as a writer and as a scholar is important to me. So I knew I wanted to finish the Beauvoir and Bell book. I know that I work better in community than in isolation, right? And so, like most of the initiatives that I've ever started, I started the thing that I most needed, believing that if I needed it, then there were other Black women and women of color who also needed that space, right? So I started La Belle Vie Writers in 2020, and that was the context. And I think one of the reasons why it was so impactful and transformative, and we had so many amazing outcomes when it first started in 2020, again, was because of that specific context of people feeling really isolated and alienated in the specific context of the pandemic. But I think it also was indicative of people feeling very isolated and alienated even before the pandemic, like within their department or within their program or within their college or within their university, right? And so La Belle Vie Writers became a space where we could come together, where people could feel seen, where people could feel heard, where people could be affirmed. And we just kind of built this community, and we had this care, and we were able to be consistent in showing up for our writing. And we were able to complete tasks, right? So despite the challenges of what was going on around us, there were graduate students who got through their comprehensive exams and defended their dissertations, right, in the challenging context of the pandemic when that was happening. There were people who were assistant professors who needed to finish books or needed to finish articles for tenure, and they were able to get that finished in the context of the challenging circumstances, again, of the pandemic and the shutdown and things like that. And then there were people who were already tenured associate professors like myself who wanted to finish their next book project to go up for full, right? So for me, the Beauvoir and Bell book was the book that I was going to use to go up for full before I decided to walk away. So I walked away before even submitting my dossier to go up for full, because again, I knew that the academy was no longer aligned for me and I wanted to do some different things. So I was able to strategically exit again on my own terms. But again, I'm still a writer, I'm still a scholar, so I still finished the book, I published the book. So that was the kind of context that La Bellevue Writers first started in, right? It was already a very challenging social political context for different reasons than today, but also for related reasons to today, right? So again, it was the pandemic, it was the shutdown, people felt isolated, people felt alienated, right? So La Bellevue Writers has gone strong since 2020. I did take a break during the year that I resigned/retired from the academy, right? So I finished my position. I had, again, a tenured associate professor about to go up for full, and I resigned/retired in June of 2023. And then I took a year off for me, right? So I took like 6 months just to kind of be what I called a lady of leisure, even though I was still getting some things done during that time. But I really scaled the things that I was doing all the way back and took a break and did some traveling and like connected with friends and family and things like that. And then I had that fellowship in Germany for a couple of months. And then once I came back and kind of settled back in, and I also moved. So I was living in Pennsylvania. I moved to Georgia, which was a great move for me. So after taking that 1 year kind of sabbatical from La Bellevue Writers, I relaunched it in the summer, in August of 2024. So we've been relaunched since last August. And I've been thinking about like, what's the difference in the context when it first started in 2020 versus what's going on now. And I think, again, there's a lot of overlaps because there's a lot of uncertainty. Again, there's still a lot of isolation and alienation that people are experiencing. I think one of the main differences is like in 2020, when we first started, everybody kind of had to be at home. So there was just a different way of being able to show up because, people couldn't go anywhere anyway. Whereas now we're dealing with similar challenges as 2020 and also some far greater and different challenges than 2020, but now there are people who just have still a lot more things pulling on them, right? And so for people, if it's important to you and valuable to you to continue to get your writing done, to get your books done, and again, this is like, we have people across different contexts. So there are graduate students who are finishing their comprehensive exams and starting their dissertations. There are graduate students who are doing the dissertation and need to finish the dissertation in order to go ahead and get the PhD to move on, whether it's into an academic position or some other kind of position. And then we have professors across rank, from assistant to associate to full professors. We actually have a member who just got a named chair position, right? Like just got a promotion with a named chair, who's a full professor. But I think what we all have in common is like, we do value the work that we're doing. We still do think the work that we're doing is relevant, which is why I'm leading with this question of like, is your work still relevant in the current and unfolding social and political context? And I think for a lot of us, we would say, yes, our work is relevant, but it's an invitation to really think about like, what is the work that we're doing and is it relevant and why and for whom, right? And it may be like the work that I do is relevant for, for certain people in certain contexts and is not relevant for other people. And I'm perfectly okay with the people for whom my work is not relevant. But the more important question is like, for me, is my work relevant, right? And so for me, my writing is a sacred practice, right? My writing is an expression of like my being in the world. And it's an expression of my philosophy. It's an expression of my values, right? And so my first book was on Hannah Arendt and the Negro question, right? Like in some ways, yes, that was my tenure book. It was the book I had to write in order to get tenure. But there were things that I felt important things that needed to be said about Hannah Arendt as this philosopher of pluralism and all of these kinds of things. She was kind of considered the philosopher who got things right, who didn't fall into the same traps of the rest of the people in the Western philosophical canon. And for me, that's not the case, right? So I needed to write Hannah Arendt and the Negro question in order to really demonstrate and show that Arendt was actually caught up in the same trap as other people in the Western philosophical tradition. And yes, she did have some great insights, but she also has some really problematic oversights. And so it was a book, there's the famous quote from Toni Morrison, and Alice Walker has another version of it. Like, if there's really a book that you really want to read that hasn't been written, you have to be the person to write it. And that has definitely been my motivation for any of the books that I've ever written, right? And so the book Hannah Arendt and the Negro Question is a book that I wanted to be able to read about Arendt that had not been written. So I wrote it. So there were like a few articles about Arendt and the issues of race, but there was not a book-length manuscript dealing with the question is the Hannah Arendt and the Negro Question in as much detail and with as much depth and close reading as I give in Hannah Arendt and the Negro Question, right? And then the same for me for my book Beauvoir and Belle, right? Simone de Beauvoir is someone who is considered by many, for a lot of white women, The Second Sex is like the book that was their entry point into feminism and their awareness around like gender politics and patriarchy and all of these kinds of things. But for me, because I went to Spelman College as an undergraduate, right? Historically Black women's liberal arts college. I had professors like Beverly Guy Sheftall, right? So for me, my entry point into feminism was with Black feminism, right? My entry point into feminism was through texts like Patricia Hill Collins' Black Feminist Thought or Beverly Guy Sheftall's Words of Fire. So by the time I got around to Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, it wasn't a text that really spoke to me in the way that Patricia Hill Collins spoke to me, or Beverly Guy Sheftall spoke to me, or Bell Hooks spoke to me, right? Or any of the other figures like Lorraine Hansberry I deal with in my book, or Claudia Jones, or Audre Lorde in the book, right? So the book Beauvoir and Belle was a book that I wanted to read that hadn't been written yet. So I wrote it because it's a book that looks at how for me, my entry point into feminism was through Black feminism, not through white feminism or French feminism or Beauvoir's The Second Sex, but also it was important for me to demonstrate how several Black women and women of color had critically engaged the second sex and their work was still being ignored in the secondary literature as if it hadn't been written, right? And so somebody like Claudia Jones doesn't write directly on the second sex, but she writes the essay Into the Neglect of the Problems of Negro Women in 1949, which is the same year that The Second Sex was written, right? And Claudia Jones is able to do in 19 pages a much more in-depth kind of triple oppression thesis, intersectional, before the term intersectionality was coined, analysis of what's happening with race, class, and gender in her 19-page pamphlet than Beauvoir does in like almost 1,000 pages across 2 volumes, right? But what's also interesting about Claudia Jones is she blocked a negative review of The Second Sex from coming out in one of the communist journals when she was editor. And she helped facilitate the printing of like a serial printing of several sections of The Second Sex. And she also helped facilitate the publication of a positive review of that book, right? But Claudia Jones is not often in the conversation among Beauvoir scholars in terms of the earlier recovery of Beauvoir's work in the U.S. context, for example, right? Lorraine Hansberry wrote a very glowing review of The Second Sex in like 1957. Now, her review was not published in 1957. It didn't get published until like 1995, and it's included in Beverly Guy Sheftall's Words of Fire. But from 1995 up until the publication of my book almost, there's very little even citation of Lorraine Hansberry's review of The Second Sex, or even if it's cited, it's not actually critically engaged or engaged with any kind of depth, right? Or we can look at Audre Lorde, her very popular essay, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. The space that essay was first delivered as a speech was at a 1979 conference that was commemorating the publication of Beauvoir's The Second Sex, right? So here are 3 Black women, and these are the first 3 chapters of my book, Beauvoir and Belle, 3 Black women who are engaging either directly or indirectly with Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, who are not really taken up in the secondary literature, right? So my writing of Beauvoir and Belle was important to me and relevant for me because I wanted to make sure that we did not continue to, or that the secondary literature did not continue to overlook the work that had been done by Black women critically engaging the second sex. But I also wanted to show that each of these figures had their own philosophies, were doing their own thing in a way that wasn't just piggybacking onto white feminism, right? Like there's a Black feminist, there's a history of Black feminist thought that both predates but also exceeds what we think of as white feminism, any of the waves of white feminism. And so that was like work that was important for me to do in terms of my writing and what I was putting out there, right? So again, the question that we're thinking about is like, is your work still relevant? Like, what is the work that you're doing, and is your work still relevant? So for me, as a philosopher, as a writer, as a scholar, even though I'm not in the academy anymore, my work as a philosopher, as a writer, as a scholar is still very important to me, and it's still relevant to me, right? So those are my first two books. The book that I'm working on right now is a book on Audre Lorde, right? So I kind of have a teaser into Audre Lorde with the chapter in Beauvoir and Bell focusing on Audre Lorde. But again, that teaser is mostly focused on the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And so I'm excited about my current project on Audre Lorde because, again, I think it's relevant for the times, right? Like I think about Audre Lorde's philosophy of survival, for example, and how relevant that is for, again, the current social, political, economic climate that we're in, and really thinking about what does survival look like. And for Lorde, survival was not merely subsistence. I know some people are like, I don't want to just survive, I want to thrive. And I think there's a way of belittling what survival actually means. And so I really do look more in depth at Lorde's philosophy of survival. I'm looking at her philosophy of the erotic, or what I call erotic empowerment, and how important and powerful that is, right? And so when I think about Lorde's notion of the erotic, especially in uses of the erotic is power, although I'm not limiting my analysis to that particular essay. But she talks about the erotic, yes, in sensual terms and sexual terms, which are important. Pleasure is important. But she also talks about it in terms of like satisfaction with life more generally. She talks about it in terms of creativity, in terms of expression, right? And so I think, again, given the current circumstances that we're navigating and things that are continuing to unfold, it's important for us to think about what the satisfaction with life look like under the current circumstances and the potential, the things that we can kind of see coming down the line. What does creativity look like in a system that focuses just on productivity and constantly churning things out without necessarily feeling connected to it or having any meaning making associated with it? What does it mean to connect to our sensuality and sexuality under the current circumstances? And also, what does it mean to work in community? Like, one of the other things that I do love about Lorde is her emphasis on her philosophy of difference, right? Which is something else that I take up, and also interdependence, right? And so even looking at like Lorde's philosophy of care, like when we think about self-care, that gets, a word that's kind of become, I don't want to say politicized in different kinds of ways. It's a word that's used a lot in a very commercial surface way. But for Lorde, self-care was not about this like individual independent thing. She, again, is going to emphasize interdependence and community and difference over this very individual kind of atomistic approach to self-care. But for her, when she first talks about self-care, her life is literally hanging in a balance, right? When she says caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that's political warfare. She's dealing with a cancer diagnosis, right? And so she's literally trying to figure out like what's happening with this cancer diagnosis. How am I going to survive in the aftermath of this cancer diagnosis, right? So I think it's important to remember the context in which some of these philosophies that we get from Audre Lorde, what are the contexts out of which they emerge, right? So I say all of that to say, yes, I think my work is still important. I think my work is still relevant. And part of my work is really connecting to and celebrating and uplifting and amplifying the voices of Black women philosophers. And for me, Black women philosophers are not only Black women with PhDs in philosophy, although I have a PhD in philosophy, but there are only about 50 Black women in the US with a PhD in philosophy. So when I think about Black women as philosophers, I'm not limiting that to Black women who explicitly have a PhD in philosophy, right? Like Audre Lorde has this essay called True Philosophers, where she self-identifies as a philosopher, even though her PhD is in like literature, right? I think she wrote a dissertation on Toni Morrison, but I think Lorde is right when she self-identifies as a true philosopher or a lover of wisdom, right? So for me, Bell Hooks is a true philosopher. Patricia Hill Collins, who's trained as a sociologist, is still a philosopher. Claudia Jones is a philosopher. Lorraine Hansberry is a philosopher. And Audre Lorde is certainly a philosopher, right? So I'm excited to be working on this current project on Audre Lorde that really centers core philosophies that we get from Audre Lorde. So I already mentioned the erotic, I mentioned the philosophy of difference, I mentioned the philosophy of care. Also in there is her philosophy of education, her pedagogical approaches, because for her, teaching and writing were very interconnected. I also look at her philosophy of mothering and how she showed up as a mother, but also how she was mothered. So her analysis of her own mother, as well as her analysis of mothering and motherhood. And then I also look at her in terms of her kind of diasporic identity and kind of trans nationalism, internationalism in terms of her feminism, right? Because she was U.S. focused, but she definitely was very connected to what was happening on the continent, right? She was connected to things like anti-apartheid movements, as well as things that were happening in the Caribbean. So that work isn't like Audre Lorde's work around these issues was important. Amplifying that work for me is important, as well as the other Black women's voices that I have amplified, right? So again, an invitation to think, hey, how are you doing? An invitation to think about what is the work you're doing? Why are you doing it? And why is it relevant? And for whom is it relevant, right? And so for me, so part of the work that I'm doing is, again, continuing to be a philosopher, continue to be a writer, continuing to be a scholar. Part of the work that I'm doing is continuing to hold space for other Black women and women of color, again, across ranks, who are also continue to identify as writers and as scholars who are working on different projects. And so, again, it has been a joy and a pleasure and an honor, really, to hold space for people across ranks, right? So again, graduate students, assistant professors, associate professors, full professors who have named chairs, who really just want to protect the space to do the writing, again, with all of the things that are going on. And so one of the centerpieces of La Belle Vie Writers is literally just being able to set aside the space and the time to get the writing done. Hey, how are you doing? Right. And so the outcomes and transformations that come with that are literally people finishing their degrees, finishing their articles. Hey, how are you doing? Finishing their books, right? Being able to, going into tenure track jobs, earning tenure, earning promotion to full professor, right? Like, so those are tangible outcomes. But it's also, again, being seen, being heard, being validated when you're in spaces that otherwise try to ignore you or marginalize you or make you feel invisible or make you feel like your work is not relevant and your work is not important, right? And so there is this container of space for actually being about the business of getting the writing done, right? And that's important. There's also this component of checking in and group coaching where we can talk through, okay, these are the challenges that are coming up for me right now, or this is a situation that's arising in the context of, like, again, departmental politics or college politics or broader politics, right? And so, we're not so much in a bubble that we are pretending, like putting our heads in the sand and pretending the things that are unfolding around us are not unfolding, right? And so it's really been beautiful for me. Again, it's an honor to be able to hold the space, and it's a space for me as well. So I benefit from being in the space, but I'm also honored to be able to hold the space to have the kind of conversations around, okay, these are how things are unfolding, nationally and internationally. These are how things are unfolding specifically in my department or in my college or at my university, and talking through strategies for navigating those things, right? And so for some people, the strategy is like, how do you strategically say no to things that are being put on you that you don't want to do or that are not relevant or do not feel aligned with your value system? Sometimes those strategies are changing departments, right? Or changing where your affiliations are in terms of what department you're in. So like my first tenure track job was in African American and Diaspora Studies. And then when I switched institutions, my tenure track job was in philosophy. I earned tenure in philosophy, but I also had affiliate faculty status in African American Studies and in women's gender and sexuality studies, for example, right? And so the reason that I did that was strategic because I didn't want, rather than have a joint appointment with philosophy and AFAM and women's gender sexuality studies, I chose to keep my tenure home 100% in philosophy and have affiliate faculty status in African American studies and women's gender sexuality studies. Now, the reason I did that is because when I was going through tenure and promotion process, and as I was about to go up for the promotion process to full, I didn't want multiple. So the way the institution works, that where I was, as many department appointments as you had, each of them had to do a letter. Basically, everybody had a say in the tenure and promotion process. For me, I'd rather have one department that I'm dealing with that ultimately has a say in that decision instead of 2 or 3 departments, right? Also, if you're a junior faculty member, if you're jointly appointed, a lot of times it means you're doing double of everything. Even if you have like a 49% in one department and 51% on the other, and theoretically you're doing half in both to make up 100%, more often than not, what's actually happening is you're doing 200% because you're doing like all the same like committee work and administrative work and service work in both departments, and the one department doesn't quite see or pay attention to what you're doing in the other department, right? So sometimes that's not the case, but more often than not, that is the case. And as somebody who was I was an interim department head for African American Studies twice, where a lot of the faculty were jointly appointed, and where I saw a lot of burnout because, again, those faculty were doing double duty across multiple departments, right? And so these are some of the things that we talk about in terms of strategic planning and group coaching and check-ins, just like how to navigate these things. And I recently had I always have gratitude for this space that is just a beautiful space. I call my beloved writing community. But like last week when we were doing a check-in, one of the members said, and I posted about this on Instagram actually, one of the members said, one of the things that I'm really focusing on is being well resourced, right? And what she meant by that was not just financial, right? Like I think when we hear well resourced, we tend to think monetary or material resources. And I think, that's not insignificant, but that's not what she was talking about. She was talking about in terms of like being well resourced with her energy and how she spent her energy and being really intentional about how she was spending her energy. She was talking about being well resourced in terms of her spiritual practices and the people that she's in spiritual community with. She was talking about being well resourced in terms of just building community more generally, like both her academic community as well as people outside of the academy, and being connected to like La Bellevue writers. She was talking about being well resourced in terms of being like intentional with her time and the projects that she was working on, and what she was going to opt into and what she was going to opt out of, right? And so it was just such a powerful moment. Like as soon as she said as soon as she uttered the words, right? Like I'm being intentional about being well resourced. It really just shifted something in me of like, oh yeah, what does being well resourced look like and feel like, and how can we be more intentional about that? And even as that shifted something in me, her using the language of well resourced, I also had this moment of like, I have so much gratitude to have this beloved writing community where we can share these kind of strategies that we're using as we're navigating, this thing called life, right? We also have members who've talked about, okay, these are how we're reaching out to different representatives and things like that to voice our concerns about things that are happening and things that are unfolding. We have people who are being intentional about doing nothing and preserving their peace and preserving their space and time, taking the position, like I did all kinds of things leading up to this point. And I don't feel responsible for fixing the mess that is being made right now, right? And I think that is also a valid position. And the opt-out is not just, it's not necessarily doing nothing. It's like, again, how am I going to cultivate community in ways that we can continue to survive? Again, thinking about Audre Lorde's philosophy of survival, in ways that don't overly rely on certain kinds of institutional structures. So yeah, I would love to hear from you guys. Definitely, like and subscribe and comment, but I'm curious about how you're thinking about the work you're doing, or even the distinction that I make between jobs and work, or title and work, or employer and work. But do you feel like your work is still relevant? And again, for me, I feel like my work is still relevant, again, as a philosopher, as a writer, as a scholar, as founder of La Bellevue Writers. But I'm curious about, for those of you who are listening, do you feel like your work is relevant? And if you don't feel like your work is relevant, what kind of shifts do you want to make to address that, right? And so again, I'm not advocating for everybody to go out and quit their jobs or anything like that, unless, you feel called to do that and you are being intentional about how to kind of do that in a strategic way. So one of the things that are offered through liability writers, for example, like we have the High Achievers course suite where you can think through some of these, again, deeper existential questions. So I use what I call embodied existentialism as one of my methods in terms of how I approach doing liability academy, including liability writers and including high achievers. So like in the High Achievers course suite that I offer, there are questions around like your values, there are questions around your why or your purpose, there are questions around your wants or your desires, right? And so there are opportunities to do deeper dives on those kinds of deeper life relevant existential questions through like the High Achievers course suite or through like the Exit Strategies course suite. Again, if you are looking at like I want to be strategic in exiting the academy, that's an excellent course suite where I literally walk you through what my exit strategy was when I decided to walk away from the academy. And I go through the fears that come up. I go through the financial questions and how I navigated that. And then I talk about freedom and what being toward freedom looks like and what does it look like to imagine freedom on the other side of that decision. And so those are some things that you can go through in the Exit Strategies course suite. And so I think that remains relevant for me now because I'm thinking about, again, people who want to leave on their own terms. How can they be strategic about leaving? The people who don't want to leave, who may be forced to leave, right? Who may have to leave on the institution's terms and not on their own terms. It's good to think through like what is going to be your strategy for negotiating that and having a strategy in place before it happens, right? So whether it's an opportunity to be intentional about planning for something that's not necessarily inevitable, but it's possible, right? And so that feels like a very relevant thing that I'm offering through liability writers. And so those are things like those course suites can be accessed individually, but they're also available as part, like if you're in liability writers, then you have access to those course suites. But I also want to make sure that, again, I want to stay connected to community. I want to stay relevant to people who may not be able to opt into, say, liability writers or the paid course suite. So I do have some things that I'm offering complimentary to people because, again, I do think, some of this, it's all important and relevant information. So I want it to be as accessible as possible, right? So some complimentary things that I have available, and I will link to this. It's in my link tree now, I believe, on where I'm live now. And then on YouTube, I will also link it when I post a YouTube video. But I have purposeful planning is like a mini course suite that I'm making available complimentary. And that basically goes through like the first 3 classes in the High Achievers course suite. So it focuses on the brain dump, or just what I say, like getting things out of your head and onto the page. So you're not just constantly like ruminating on things in your mind, but getting them out of your head and onto the page. So there's the brain dump is part of the purposeful planning. Then there's also eliminate, negotiate, delegate, defer. So again, when you think about like all the things that are on your plate and you kind of do the brain dump, how do you sort through and parse out, what you're going to do and what you're not going to do? So ENDD is eliminate, like what on that list are you going to eliminate altogether and decide you're not going to do it, and the world will still keep spinning, right? What are you going to negotiate? You may have to negotiate with other people, like deadlines or responsibilities. Say if you're co-authors on something, like how do you negotiate who's responsible for what? How do you negotiate the distribution of labor in your home or in your department or on a committee or whatever the case may be? Delegate is just delegating things to other people. That might be if you have access to a research budget, hiring research assistants to help you with some of the things you're doing, or if you have access to some disposable income on the domestic front, what does it look like to delegate some of the home responsibilities to other people and compensate them for it, right? And then defer just means, something that you deferred the deadline to a later deadline. You defer, you're like, it may be something that you thought you were going to get done this month or this year, and you decided, given my new order of priorities, this is something that's going to be deferred. It doesn't mean it will never get done. It just means you're deferring it to a later date until you can get to it and you have the time and the energy to commit to it, right? So there's the brain dump, there's the eliminate, negotiate, delegate, defer, and then there's the quarter plan. And so the quarter planning system for me is a system that I use because I didn't want to necessarily do a semester plan where my life was dictated by the university's timeline or time schedule. I like 90 days, like the planners that I tend to use tend to be 90-day planners. And so I do quarter planning because when I was still a professor, when I was still an academic, it helped me not orient my life toward just the semester. And when I was no longer a professor, it helped me just continue. Like 90 days is enough time to make significant progress on something, but not so much time that you're not like checking in. So the quarter planning is also included in that. So again, the purposeful planning course suite is like a mini course suite that is available complimentary. And then I also created, and this is kind of still in the works, Professor Playbook, where I'm really just kind of collecting together some of my relevant experience as an academic over 20 years, going back to undergrad, but not so much going through the nitty gritty of undergrad. Really, I just talk a little bit about like applying to graduate school as an undergrad. And then I go a little bit through the graduate school years, and then through those years going from postdoc to assistant professor to associate professor, and getting to the point where I was going to go up for full professor, but decided to walk away because my ancestors said so, and the work that I was doing no longer felt aligned. So I think, again, there's a case concerning the exits from academia. I think there are cases for staying if you want to stay and if that work still feels aligned for you. I think there are cases for leaving if you want to leave and that work does not feel aligned for you. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that. I think a lot of times people will try to dictate or influence what you choose to do, how you choose to do it, on what terms you choose to do it. And I'm not interested in dictating anybody's choices to anyone, right? Like, I am all in on existentialism. I believe in freedom. I believe in choice. I believe in responsibility, right? So for me, like, I often talk about my trinity of things that I've left, institutions that I left, in forms of institutional bondage that I left, include the church, marriage, and academia, right? And so each of those institutions, when they no longer felt aligned for me, I walked away from them, right? When I was in them, there was nobody that was going to convince me to walk away from them because I was in them and I wanted to be in them. When I was ready to get out of them, there was nobody who could convince me to stay in them because I knew they were no longer aligned for me, right? So my invitation to people is always to check in with yourself, check in with your sense of purpose, check in with your values, check in with what feels aligned or not for you, and do you, and like, say it with your chest, do it with your chest, right? So I always say, like, if you love the church and the church has been a source of refuge or community or whatever the case may be for you, then I'm not advocating that you leave something that is working well for you. For me, the patriarchy, the homophobia, the elitism, the anti-intellectualism, and some of those spaces no longer align for me. And then I also the last church that I was a part of was like one of these big black mega churches. I really saw the dark underbelly of what those systems look like, and what the ministers and all the people, they were not about the life that they were preaching about. So I became very disillusioned with that. So I still very much have spiritual practices, right? I still believe in the divine. I still believe in spiritual guidance and ancestors and all kinds of things, but I don't think that needs to come through some man pimping in a pulpit. You know what I mean? So when I was ready to walk away from the church, I walked away from it. When I was ready to walk away from the marriage, I walked away. Like, I knew that was no longer aligned. I knew when it was time to leave. And I was very strategic in my exit from the marriage as well. And then the third institution for me was the academy. It worked really well when it was working, but when it was no longer aligned, I knew it was time to go. And again, I exited on my own terms, right? So my invitation to people is always to stay connected to your true self, to your intuition, to your sense of purpose, and make decisions that are aligned with that rather than following somebody else's formula or, chasing behind somebody else's dreams. Right. So because I have the experience of 20 years being in the academy, I'm happy to continue to work with people who are navigating the academy. And because I have been really strategic in my exit from the academy, I'm happy to work with people who are working on their strategic exit from the academy, right? Like, there's not a right or wrong answer there. My only invitation is, like, do what feels aligned for you. Because when you do what feels aligned for you, then it doesn't fall. Like, again, it's freedom, choice, and responsibility. You have the freedom to choose what you're going to do. And then you have the responsibility you have to take responsibility for those choices that you make, right? And I think when you make those choices and you're, eyes wide open about the choices that you make, hey, how are you doing? When your eyes wide open about the choices that you make, then you can live with those choices in a different way than if you're following somebody else's program or doing what you think somebody else expects you to do. Right. And so, again, connecting to that sense of freedom, that sense of choice, and that responsibility. And if you're going to stay in the academy, how do you navigate it? And I'm happy to help you with that. If you're going to leave the academy, how do you strategically exit? And I'm happy to help you with that. But again, coming back to this, is your work still relevant for me? Because I still identify as a philosopher, I still identify as a writer, I still identify as a scholar. Writing books is still important to me. The people that I work with, writing books is still important to them, right? It's their way of expressing themselves in the world, it's their way of making an impact in the world. And so, even with everything that's going on right now, now is the time that people really want to recommit to the writing. And how do you write about and record not only what's happened historically, but what's unfolding before our eyes, even as we speak, right? And so now, again, for some people, if you're like, okay, the greatest, for me to have my greatest impact, I feel like it can't be necessarily in writing a book. I might be doing something else. Do whatever it is that you think you need to do to have the impact that you want to have. But for the people for whom writing, whether it's your articles or books or pamphlets or whatever the case may be, and you would like a space to support that, then La Bellevue Writers is, I'm happy to be able to offer that space through La Bellevue Writers. And so again, it's been amazing to see people who have been with me since 2020 and have, just kind of evolved and grown over these last 5 years, up to people who have joined more recently and been able to just really join into the community and take advantage of the community and benefit from the community. So my long answer to the question, is your work still relevant, is yes. I feel like my work is still very relevant. I feel very honored to be able to do the work that I'm doing. I appreciate that I have been very choiceful and intentional about the kind of work that I'm doing. And that I'm able to do it on my own terms, that I'm able to, again, be in this beloved writing community, connected with other beautiful, brilliant writers and scholars and authors across a lot of different disciplines. Of course, like, again, I'm trained in philosophy, but we have people in Africana studies, we have people in art history, we have sociologists, we have people in colleges of education. So there's a lot in history. There's a lot of different disciplines that are represented in La Bellevue Writers, and that also in literature, African American literature, as well as other kinds of literature. So that's also part of the power of the community, is that it's so interdisciplinary, but everyone has so many different insights. And I always say, like, if one person has a question, like, there's power in asking that question in community, because if one person has the question, it's probably going to resonate for other people. And I'm happy to respond to that question, but there's also beautiful kind of peer coaching that happens where other people, like, there's so much expertise in the room that you're likely to get some amazing feedback, not only from me holding the space for group coaching, but also for other members of La Bellevue Writers. And so that also has been beautiful to build that and to see the people who have come into that space. So sending lots of encouragement to everybody. As you reflect on the work that you're doing, the work that you choose to do, and how relevant that work is. And I really want you to reflect on this question from the inside out, not from the outside in, right? So when I ask, is your work relevant? It's not a do other people think your work is important question. It's a, does the work you're choosing to do resonate with who you are, resonate with your value system, resonate with your sense of purpose, resonate with your deepest desires, right? That's the kind of question that I'm asking when I say, is your work relevant? And so as I was reflecting on this question for myself, I can give a resounding yes to that question, right? Like, I feel like my work is more relevant now than it has ever been. And I have gratitude to be chosen at such a time as this to do the work that I am doing. Okay. So there are links in my bio to all the things. I will also put links in YouTube when I post this on YouTube. But thanks to everybody who showed up and for listening. It's always a pleasure to connect with you guys, sending everybody lots of love and positive energy always. And I look forward to seeing you again, if not in the complimentary offers that I have for Purposeful Planning and the Professor Playbook, then in La Bellevue Writers or one of the course suites, High Achievers, Exit Strategies are one of those options. But I have a lot of options available. I have gratitude for being able to make those offers available. And I look forward to connecting with more of you in those spaces. Have a wonderful evening. Bye.